So just to orient you a little bit to what motivated us to have this event tonight. So to begin with, for those of you who don't know, Cafe Scientifique are really actually international, but here in Canada they're funded by the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, and they're really meant for an exchange between researchers and other interested stakeholders with the public to exchange ideas about research and ideas about health and prevention or intervention. So just to give you a quick overview of the kinds of things we're interested in our lab at SFU, we primarily focus on autism research, but we also do quite a bit of research on just normal development and trying to understand what social competence is all about. So we look at specific aspects of social competence. How do, for example, children become socially competent? What are those behaviors that are particularly interesting to look at that will tell us a lot about how the social competence emerges and then develops into adulthood? So some of the things we're interested in are things like, why are people so interested in what other people are looking at? Why are faces so interesting? And what is it about faces that captivates even very young infants? And then, of course, you know, through social interaction and experience, how do children learn what's socially meaningful and how to have a really good social interaction among peers? And how are these abilities nurtured, and what are the kinds of experiences that are either risk factors or protective factors for these kinds of abilities to develop? And of course, all of this is based on a really good definition of social competence, which we've been struggling with. There's not a lot of guidance out there right now in the literature to help us to really define the construct. It's a very complex idea. Social competence involves a lot of different very basic things and then very much more sort of higher level cognitive, emotional, and social aspects. And so we're trying to define it and find ways, measures, to measure it in children and adults. The other thing we're really interested in is what aspects of social competence are affected in children with ASD. Not all aspects of social functioning are impaired, and it varies from child to child. So we're interested in looking at that variability and what is it particularly on profiles, particularly for individuals that either show us, you know, what areas we need to tackle or what kind of supports they need. And some of the things that we are hoping to look at is how does the lack of social competence or particular aspects of social competence affect family quality of life? Another really important issue that we've been grappling with is what is it about social competence that, how is it related to mental health? There's a really interesting sort of reciprocal relationship there, and we don't quite know what comes first, how is it all sort of related. but we know that lack of social competence affects people's mental health, and obviously it's a vicious circle because if you don't have friends or you don't have good, strong social connections, it's a real big risk factor for mental health problems. So I hope this gives you a flavor of the kind of work that we do at the Autism Lab, and also why we're so interested in hosting an event like this, because I think all of these kinds of issues related to social competence and the kinds of things that either contribute to it or hinder somebody with regard to their development of social competence affects how children cope in various settings like family, school, and community. So one of the reasons I think our goal for tonight was to broaden our dialogue about bullying and not to focus so much on the traditional definition of bullying, but to think about it in broader terms. So for example, you know, bullying, there's many more aspects, and not just the active sort of rejection of someone, but also somebody being ignored or left out, or just being indifferent to somebody's lack of social connection or friendships. The other thing is we wanted to maybe explore with you some ideas related to the difference between social tolerance, social acceptance, and inclusion, and talk about how those things might be similar or different. And at the same time, excuse me, you know, the broadening of the term is important, but we also wanted to sort of fine-tune the discussion and focus specifically on autism, because this dialogue, bullying, and issues around social acceptance have been talked about before, but there hasn't been actually a lot of dialogue specifically related to children or individuals with autism. And so I think tonight, hopefully, we'll get a little bit more into the particulars of what is it specifically about people with autism that either puts them at risk for bullying or for being bullied, and for lack of social acceptance. Okay, so I think I'll turn it over to Emily, who's the co-host, and it was really all her initiative to get this going, to get the funding for this. She worked tirelessly to get this event going. I actually forgot to mention, I'm sorry, that one of our panel members, Dr. Elizabeth Kelly, who is going to be here with us from Queen's University, due to a personal tragedy in her family, couldn't make it tonight. So, you know, she sends regrets, and we'll try to cover some of the issues that she would have brought up tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily, and she'll lay the groundwork.
Okay, thanks, Grace. So my name is Emily Gardner, and I'm a doctoral student in the Autism and Developmental Disorders Lab at SFU. We call it the ADDL, so I'll say that from now on to make it easier. And we're thrilled to be hosting, together with the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, this Cafe Scientifique event entitled What About Me? Reflections on Autism and Why Bullying is So Easy and Acceptance So Tough. So thank you so much for joining us, and congratulations on being able to find the room. So I approached my supervisor, Dr. Iorochi, last summer about hosting this event because I think these are both such important issues. We know that the behaviors that are typically associated with autism, such as rigid, special interests, repetitive behaviors, and a lack of eye contact, can make peer relationships difficult, but we also know that it actually kind of sets these individuals apart, identifies them as different, and can make them easy targets for bullies. So research actually tells us that bullying or peer victimization occurs at least 3 times as often for individuals with autism than for their peers, and that these rates remain high across development, so through childhood and adolescence. And I think it's important that we consider both peer victimization as well as acceptance as active processes. And we think about the long-term social and mental health implications, as well as how we can redirect these negative trends. So look towards a more positive future. And these are just some of the issues that we'll be discussing with our diverse panel of experts. And yeah, this is the layout for our evening. So we'll start by hearing from each member of our panel, and they'll share a little bit about their research or personal experience. And we really hope that this is going to inspire questions and discussion. And the purpose of these events is really to hear from you. So after our panel speaks, we're going to take a break and you can enjoy some appetizers. And we hope you guys take that opportunity to talk to one another, to think of questions, and we'll give you a few options. So after the break, you can raise your hand and direct a question at a specific panel member, or just generally ask it, and it can be a collaborative effort. Or there's these notepads and pens on your chairs. So if you're more comfortable, feel free to write them down and just drop them in the bowl, and we'll try and go back and forth between the two. Also, one more housekeeping. At the break, we're going to put evaluation forms on the chairs. They're very brief, and we really, really hope you take the time to fill these out because they are so helpful in helping us to improve future events. So now I'll introduce our panel. I'll start with, I'll go in the order that they'll speak. So I'll start with Lizzie Goldstone. So she's an undergraduate psychology student and volunteer in our lab. She has a sibling with autism, and she's going to share some of her personal experience with bullying. Elizabeth Hansen has an adolescent son with autism who's just about to graduate high school, and he has personal experience with bullying that she'll talk a little bit about. Dr. Anthony Bailey is right beside me, is the Institute of Mental Health Chair in Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and a Professor of Psychiatry at UBC. He is the founding editor of Autism Research Journal, and his research investigates the neurobiological basis of autism. And Dr. Grace Irochi is an associate professor of psychology and director of our lab at SFU, and her clinical expertise is in child development and psychopathology, and her research focuses on how attention, perception, and cognition relate to social development in individuals with and without ASD. So Lizzie, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Thank you, Emily. Hello, everyone. Today I hope to share with you a little bit about my experiences with autism, but more specifically bullying. First off, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on my sister Morgan, who has autism. So my sister was born on April 1st, 1998, which makes her 14 years old now. She was really happy and playful as a baby. She surpassed her milestones very quickly, actually ahead of other children. However, shortly after her 18-month-old shots, she lost her ability to communicate, physically get around. She was no longer walking. She was laying on the floor. She developed moderate, severe behavior issues. And my parents were really worried that she had some life-threatening condition, or that maybe they were just overreacting and she was just going through a phase. But my family soon turned to a doctor for some answers, and that's when Morgan was diagnosed with autism. Our family didn't have any experience with special needs individuals at all, so we didn't really know what to expect. The times were hard at first, but we adapted quite quickly with the help of our ABA team. And the first thing we did was we put Morgan on the autism diet, and we started 40 hours a week of intervention. Soon after beginning her treatment, within about a year, Morgan lost her behaviors of pinching, scratching, flapping, aggressive behaviors, self-stimulatory behaviors, and all of those behaviors went down substantially. It was amazing. And that was our first major breakthrough in treating Morgan. So now to jump forward a little bit to the present. Last year, Morgan graduated from grade 7 with her own age group, and she walked across the stage all by herself without her SEA. And I have to say, this is definitely one of the proudest moments of my life. So right now, Morgan's in grade 8 in a typical high school. She is in a special classroom, a BASIS classroom, and she's there for about 70% of her days, and the rest of the time she is in typical classrooms with peer tutors, which are also attending high school. Most of them are grade 12 students. She reads at a grade 12 reading level. She can read encyclopedias. She carries around a stack of novels like this high all the time. She wants to take them all to school. Like she reads like no other person. And she also has the best memory ever. She memorizes movies after watching them once. And then as they're playing again, she'll just like completely say all the lines. It's amazing. She has the ability to ask for her essential needs, but she can only have short conversations when she wants to. She has no behavior issues at all, and she can understand any request or complex sentence. She can pretty much do whatever you need her to do. She can sit in a restaurant and have a meal for mostly about 2 hours she can last, which is pretty good. She can go to a movie without plugging her ears now. And she hasn't been held back in school thanks to our professional teams and our persistence, definitely. So now that you have a bit of an understanding of Morgan's level of functioning, I'm going to get to our main topic of bullying. So a child has never bullied my sister directly, but my family did experience prejudice because of my sister's diagnosis. My sister had a good friend throughout elementary school, from grade 1 to 6, and this friend came to all of her birthdays, was trained by the SEA to work on socialization and inclusion. And during my sister's grade 6 year, we had found out that this girl suddenly began to ignore my sister. She wouldn't talk to her, and she'd basically pretend she didn't exist. And this was really hard because they were in the same classroom, so it was pretty noticeable that the girl was avoiding my sister. So my sister was quite confused and frustrated, and so we soon found out the girl's mother had found out my sister's diagnosis and would no longer let her child be around my sister at all. She actually went as far as to request her child into a different classroom. My mom and I were in complete shock. Our hearts were broken. Like, how are we supposed to explain this to my sister? That she couldn't associate with her friend anymore. And we never imagined that we'd have to go through something like this so terrible. So my parents went to the school and confronted the principal and the teachers about this issue. The school responded that Morgan should move on and meet new people because she would have to do that in her life at some point anyways. So we were left cleaning up a mess of my sister asking for her friend every day, multiple times. So that made us quite sick inside. I believe that Morgan was really affected by this because now whenever we leave her with her respite care worker or I go on holidays, she gets really upset because she thinks we're never coming back and that we'll never talk to her again. And I've kind of made it my duty now, more than ever, to make the public aware of autism and definitely the bullying that can come around with it. From the moment I was old enough to understand that my sister had autism, I was really passionate about doing anything I could to help out anybody that needed help. I would try to explain to children, even when I was 10 years old, how they could communicate with my nonverbal sister, how they could sign to her, how they could talk to her really slowly, how I could explain things to my sister and they could communicate back and forth. So that's why I believe that educating the general public right now is definitely the best thing to do. I also believe that special interest groups that advocate for children with ASD and Asperger's, such as our lab at SFU and Autism Speaks, Autism United, those are also very valuable tools. As well as public programs through the various cities in BC. They have a lot of inclusion involved in their summer camps with their support workers. The internet's also a very valuable place to find forums with other families that go through hardships and comfort each other with their unique experiences. But now I'd like to mention a few things specifically that I've done to help spread awareness about autism. When I was 10 years old, I began volunteering with the Delta Center for Child Development. That's where my sister's ABA therapy and such was provided through. I started making sensory items, organizing their lending library, getting involved with their community events, their family events. Following this, I began peer tutoring teens in my high school. I volunteered with Operation Track Shoes that happens at UVic, which I worked with adults with ASD. I also worked with community living, and I continue to do so for 3 years, providing support in their summer camps, their skating and swimming programs, and also providing some education for the children that are in the camps. And more recently, I've become a behavior interventionist, which I love, and I started working with the ADDL at SFU. And I recently made a large purchase and invested a tattoo on half of my leg, which is my sister's name, and puzzle pieces, which is quite a conversation starter. And I find that really helps definitely in spreading awareness because everybody asks about it, and I'm very happy to inform them about my sister. So just to conclude, I have to say I never dreamed of having such an amazing person in my life. She can make me laugh and cry all in the same minute, and she's the most loving, intelligent, beautiful girl, and I couldn't be more proud to call her my sister. But finally, I want to thank every one of you for being here tonight and for all of the hard work that went into planning this event, because by coming together, we can truly make a difference in the lives of everybody that's affected with ASD. So, thank you.
I guess that means it's my turn. Thank you very much for sharing that. I think it's amazing when people can come together as a community and share stories. First of all, my name is Elizabeth, and this is my Zach, who was invited to join us tonight, but got a little scared. Zach was first diagnosed when he was in grade 1 and is graduating. They have their grad party tomorrow, as a matter of fact. And going through, when we were first invited to come and join you guys on the panel, Zach was quite enthusiastic about talking about some of his experiences and sharing with people. But then he was working on his multimedia stuff, which he loves to do. He's a real computer geek. And as he was starting to go through some of his experiences, this level of sadness started coming over him. And he just kind of said, Mom, I'm having a hard time putting this together to talk in front of a bunch of people. And we talked about it a lot, and he kind of shared a very poignant thing and said he just wanted to be known as Zach. He didn't want to be known as his label. And that's part of the challenge that a lot of the kids go through, I think, is that there's this stigma that comes with it, of course, and people look at the label, they don't look at the child. And we talked more, because I was trying to encourage him, because he has such wisdom and wit that he can bring to his experiences. And I got to the point where I was felt like I was bullying him into it. So that's when I took a step back and went, as mom, I can't do that. And I respect his need for anonymity, I guess, if nothing else. And he's earned the right to be Zach, not the child with autism. Zach has had a number of very strong teaching experiences for me as a mother. He's taught me to embrace a number of different things. I think that I don't know, maybe any child would teach a mother, but specifically I can only go with our own experiences. But it's tough in school for kids, I think for all kids, let alone children on the spectrum. Part of the challenge is that children on the spectrum don't understand why other kids don't think the same way that they do. They have no concept that my guy's a real train fanatic and can't understand why people don't understand the bolt configuration on the side of a 292 whatever. I mean, he can identify a train by the sound of the horn and let you know where it was made, and like he's got an encyclopedic knowledge on a number of different things, but specifically his one passion, which is trains. And he, for the life of him, cannot understand why, as a young child, going up to anyone on the street and launching into a wonderful tirade about this depth knowledge that he has, and people looking at him with this glazed look on their face going, how can they not know what I'm talking about, or how can they not relate to what I'm talking about? And it's difficult to have them take a step back to understand that not everyone thinks the same way. And to also help them understand that being on the spectrum is not necessarily a disorder, it's a different thinking. Because there's too many disses involved, I think, that are out there for everybody to have to deal with, let alone feeling that you're a label or feeling that you're less than. And that's, I think, part of where the challenges began. The bullying thing comes in every single level you can imagine. It's not just the physical stuff, because the physical stuff does happen, and the physical stuff comes from being poked with a pencil endlessly until you have a meltdown because somebody's not stopping. They're the ones who don't get caught. You're just the one who gets caught for having a meltdown that people can't understand. Or having teachers or even EAs, learning assistants or whichever, that don't understand the level of escalation and how early you can intervene and not necessarily have someone go ballistic on a playground. There's also I think, the early years were fairly good. As I say, Zach he was blessed with some incredible teachers. They were young teachers, new to the teaching community. They weren't old school. And I think a lot of new thought is needed. You can't, I'm going to steal it, but you can't fix today's problems with yesterday's solutions, or something like that. I think it was from Einstein. But we need to sort of try to expand our ideas on how to address some of these challenges, especially with teachers. Teachers can be bigger bullies than the kids in the schoolroom. We had some interesting experiences when Zach was in his middle years. I would say probably grade 6 and grade 7 were the toughest, because there was a couple of teachers who wanted to fix him. We had some interventions that were putting in place, as simple as chewing gum, just to help his mind connect on something else, which helped stop fidgeting. And they, of course, didn't like his idea of chewing pencils down to the quick, and all of those other neat things just to keep that mind quiet so that he could concentrate on his tasks at hand. Or the need just to get up and walk around. It's really difficult for some of these kids just to sit in one place all day. And as I say, we had some serious challenges that virtually created a setback for a number of years for Zach. We made it, we survived. We brought in external outside forces. We brought a couple of psychologists in to talk to the school. All of the teachers made sure, and that's something else as a parent you need to do, is reinvent the wheel every year. You can't just assume that the teachers learn or will read the records and have an understanding as to what's going on. As a parent, you have to, I know self-advocacy is very important to teach when they're older, but when you're younger, you got to be able to roll up your sleeves and jump in. And right at the beginning of the school year, I used to actually meet with the teachers even before school started, just to, have that one-on-one and have that ability to have a dialogue and have communication on a regular basis. You don't wait until a problem starts before you want to try to fix it. You want to try to prevent problems from happening. With dealing with the psychological end of it, we had a number of challenges with some pretty severe depression when Zach was in his middle years as well. And a lot of that is dealing with the isolation and thinking that there isn't anyone else who can understand. I know from my son's perspective, he had a really hard time with that. There's also some of the challenges that you have is the cyberbullying, which I would like to bring in as well, because a lot of these children, with them being isolated and computer geeks, getting involved on a number of chat rooms or whichever really puts them at risk for some cyberbullying, which there can be some challenges there. And I think as a parent, you need to be incredibly aware and be incredibly open and incredibly in tune to your child's just mental state. and not be afraid to call in the big guns if you need it. There's been several times we've gotten involved in with just having psychologist appointments or whatever, just to give someone's outside of the family, to give him someone to talk to. And I think that's very critical. It's helped a lot. This young gentleman, as I say, the sense of humor, the sense of pride, and the sense of purpose that he's developed have been phenomenal. That with the help of a big team behind him, and hey, he's got a long way to go yet, but we're getting there. And that's about all I need to talk about right now, I think.
Got my own, I think. Thank you to Emily and Grace for organising this evening. Although I'm an autism researcher, I'm actually going to try and talk a little bit about bullying from a clinical perspective, because I've seen over the years many adolescents and adults with ASD who've had quite severe experiences of bullying, particularly in mainstream schools and particularly during adolescence. And it's quite likely, I suspect, that most people in this room have had some experience of bullying at some time in their life. It's not a type of behaviour that's common to that's specific to Western cultures. Seems to occur throughout the world, and in fact, if you look at natural groups of non-human primates, you will see bullying behaviour. So this is not a behaviour that's specific to humans either. Which sort of begs the question of really, why do people bully? Often in non-human primates, it's related to the social hierarchy of the group, and ganging up on weaker members is part of establishing quite what the pecking order in the group is. And some of that sort of behaviour occurs in humans as well. But of course, there's also a not very clear dividing line between when good-natured teasing gradually goes so far that it becomes hurtful to the individual and ought to really be classified as bullying, and that's of course quite separate from the sort of physical bullying that is much easier to recognise. So quite often people who engage in bullying, and probably most people in this room at some stage in their life have done a bit of bullying. It's fairly normal sort of behaviour. I even heard you saying you had to stop yourself bullying your son. It's sort of asserting ourselves slightly too strongly for the situation. But your bullying was done with good intent, I suspect, even though he may not have seen it that way. But very often people bully because they enjoy seeing the reaction that it gets. And one of the reasons that it's particularly common in adolescence is that very often it will relate to whether you're in part of a group or an isolated individual. So it's not uncommon for bullying to be a group activity which either excludes other people or everyone in the group makes the same comments about somebody who's an outsider. And of course, usually the more extreme the reaction you get, as you were pointing out with your son having a meltdown on the 100th poke with the pencil, if you're in an environment where maybe you're not particularly engaged academically or you're not doing well academically, then bullying behaviour's quite an interesting alternative. And there's some evidence, of course, that literature and films would always have us believe that all bullies are cowards. It's not necessarily true, of course, because there are many reasons for bullying. But quite often bullies will have low self-esteem or not succeeding in the environment in which they're functioning, and therefore bullying is a way of making yourself feel slightly better than another individual. Why are people with ASD more vulnerable to bullying? Because they certainly are. Emily was quoting rates of 3 times the general population rate. When I worked in London, we sent out a questionnaire to about 200 families who we'd seen for new diagnoses over the previous 2 years. There was no control group, but of the families who had a child with ASD in mainstream school, i.e. an ordinary school, 100% reported that the children had been bullied at some stage. Now, one's got to be a bit wary about those sorts of numbers because it's not unusual for some children or adolescents or indeed adults with ASD to complain that they're being bullied when actually they're not. What they're receiving is teasing or comments that one might consider within the sort of normal range of everyday school life, but their lack of social awareness means that they're not able to interpret what the motivation was behind the comment. But of course, if they react excessively, then something that started out as benign may become pathological because other people may enjoy seeing this extreme reaction. And so excessive reactions to either perceived or real bullying are a real problem for individuals on the spectrum. But also there can be aspects of their own behaviour that provoke bullying. I can remember when I was a child wearing glasses and constantly being called Four Eyes at school. I mean, everyone who wore glasses was called Four Eyes, and I was sort of able to work out eventually that I didn't have four eyes. But at least I understood what the motivation behind the behaviour was. But people with ASD may react and behave in unusual ways that draws attention to themselves. They may speak in unusual ways. They may make unusual comments. Or, as you were pointing out, they may have interests that are either unusual in their content or which preoccupy them. They may have motor behaviours that make them look unusual to other people, or they may be impulsive or overactive. So all of these things can differentiate the individual with ASD from their peers and make them more vulnerable to bullying. And when typically developing children are bullied, usually what parents will say to them is to ignore it. And the reason we do that is because we know that ignoring is a very good tactic. It's the sort of classical conditioning paradigm that if the bully learns that eventually you're not going to respond to that particular insult or bit of behaviour, it usually extinguishes. But it can be very difficult sometimes to persuade people on the spectrum not to respond, and they may argue that it's unjust. That if the other person is behaving like this, why can't they react in an appropriate way? And of course, sometimes that can lead to a vicious circle because the individual with ASD may respond in a way that is actually in itself bullying. And then that just gets one into a vicious circle. So the subtle complexities, particularly of group interaction in adolescence, can often be very difficult for people with ASD to understand, and that will separate them out from the group. And unfortunately, you were describing your sister's excellent memory. It's not uncommon for people with ASD who've been the victim of teasing or bullying to find it very hard to let that issue drop. And the not letting it drop can actually maintain the behaviours that sort of were the target of bullying in the first place. The consequences of bullying, as I think both of you have pointed out, is anxiety and quite often depression. So it's very often the case that the onset of depression in adolescence in people with ASD has been linked to bullying at school. It's not usually the only cause of depression because quite often it coincides with people recognising the differences between them and their peers and recognising that their peers are moving on at a faster rate than they are. In terms of preventing bullying or dealing with it, strategies that focus on individual victims usually don't work very well, because in a sense it draws even more attention to the victim. What seems to be most effective is for schools or other educational establishments, or indeed workplaces, to have a sort of zero tolerance policy for bullying. But it can be very difficult to get teachers to sign up to that, because some teachers will see that as being mild bullying or teasing being part of the normal rough and tumble of growing up. And it can be hard sometimes to convince teachers that to the individual with ASD, something that seemed benign to other people can actually be quite painful. In terms of helping the individual with ASD to minimize bullying, it's usually best, I think, to be very, very direct and try and work out what the behaviours are that are being a target for bullying, and to give the individual advice on minimizing those behaviours. So if it's people engaging in motor mannerisms or talking repetitively about things or shouting out in class, those can be quite easy things to advise people on. It may be harder if people are misinterpreting subtle social cues or not understanding when a remark is humorous as opposed to being serious. But usually the intervention relates to some sort of educational approach that minimizes the target behavior, and also encourages the person to respond as little as humanly possible. Bullying is very often a reason why, when people move on to higher education, university in particular, that students don't want to divulge that they have autism spectrum disorders. They've had such a horrible time in mainstream school that they believe that if they don't tell anyone that they have ASD, no one will notice, and therefore they won't have the same experience. Now, of course, most people are good at spotting when other people are different than them. But one very dramatic observation throughout the world is that the rate of bullying just falls off dramatically when you move from high school to colleges or university. I'm not sure we completely understand why that is, but clearly a lot of it is to do with maturation and also people not being in the education system who didn't want to be in the education system anyhow. We also have to think about the consequences of bullying in childhood or adolescence in adult life, because I see many adults who still harbour grudges against acts of bullying, or possibly minor slights even, that occurred in childhood, and these can still be very hot issues for adults that need to be dealt with if people are going to move on satisfactorily. Bullying does occur in the workplace, and I have personal experience of adults with ASD being bullied, usually during coffee breaks or lunch breaks or times outside the normal work situation. And really the approach is the same as at school, that this is an issue for management. It should just be deemed not acceptable behaviour regardless of the nature of the individual who's being bullied. And I think that's covered most of the things I wanted to say, so I'm going to hand over to Grace. Thank you.
Okay, so what I'll try to do is actually probably support most of the things that Dr. Bailey said with summarizing some of the research out there. I have to say that there's really very limited research on bullying and ASD, probably a handful of studies, which was surprising to me, actually. But from what there is out there, the numbers vary in terms of the prevalence, so it does seem to be high, but it varies from study to study. So in one US study, it was found that people with ASD are 4 times more likely than a national sample. And then if you look at a specific subpopulation, for example, people with ASD who are in special education school settings, the rates are actually lower, which is interesting. I mean, it does make sense in certain ways. If you're in a mainstream school context, the likelihood that people will notice the differences and pick on particular individuals does increase. But still, even in the special education study, and this was done in the Netherlands, they found 26% of adolescents with ASD were bullied, so that's still quite high. Excuse me, but then when they looked at another subpopulation, when they looked at children who had ASD but also had ADHD, it was interesting. They actually found that those individuals were more likely to be bullies. But also, it depends on the study you read. People with ADHD are also at higher risk for being bullied. So they can either be bullies or be bullied. They're actually at high risk for both. So in general, I guess to summarize, the rates are high, certainly much higher than we would want, and but there's only a handful of studies on this, and certainly we need a lot more. There was no Canadian study that I found that actually looked at prevalence rates. The other interesting thing that comes out of the literature, the research on autism and bullying, is that there's this interesting interaction between a high number of risk factors coupled with low protective factors. So when you think of children at risk, you think both of what are the risks and how many risks are there, but also there's buffering that happens if you have quite a lot of protective factors on your side. So even though you have high risk, you might have a high number of protective factors that help you to cope with situations. And in the situation of people with ASD, what it's saying is that they're at high risk, but they have a lack of protective factors or very few protective factors. So things that are protective for typically developing children against bullying is, for example, having a good close friend or having social support. And these are the things that are actually people with ASD don't have often. So a lack of protective factors. The risk factors, there's probably a laundry list of risk factors, but some of the ones that kept coming up were having poor communication, poor social understanding, and sometimes even physical abilities, so clumsiness and being, not doing so well in gym class, standing out that way. Behavioral difficulties that are very obvious to other kids in the classroom. And of course, what Dr. Bailey and everyone else on the panel said, the intense emotional reactions that really get bullies going, right? And not only bullies, but their peers and their sort of co-conspirators. The other interesting theme that comes up is that prevention is less costly than intervention. So costly, and I use the term in sort of not just in terms of financial costs, but in terms of emotional and mental health costs. So one of the findings was the more often adolescents were bullied, as rated by teachers and the adolescents themselves, the more they misinterpreted non-bullying situations as bullying. So in a sense, what what they were suggesting was that the more experiences of bullying you have, the less likely you are to interpret a situation as neutral or as positive. So you tend to become much more jaded as time goes on. The other interesting sort of related finding was that in terms of costs, was that there's a reciprocal relationship between mental health and bullying, so that people who have mental health issues are more likely to be bullied, but people who are bullied also are more at risk for mental health problems. So again, that's a significant cost that we would like to avoid. So some of the situations that the researchers in these articles came up with that were preventative were sort of, I guess, could be categorized in two domains. One was changing the environment, what they called the social architecture. And here they gave examples of, for example, in the school setting, some simple rules of conduct for teachers in terms of assigning children to teams rather than having people pick their team members, assigning children to seating arrangements rather than having kids buddy up. Things like that, highlighting talents of the individual with ASD as a preventative measure, as rather than exposing weaknesses. For example, reading out loud when somebody's a poor reader, or gym class, for example, displays of physical activity while other children are watching, knowing that the child has weaknesses in those areas. So sort of rearranging the environment or the sort of rules that the teacher can really direct can make a big difference. And actually that can prevent some of these situations from happening. The other interesting thing that they mentioned, sort of this other category of prevention, prevention that can be used to help the individual with ASD, would be to help them to learn how to specific, not so much social skills, but social perception. In terms of decoding what is happening in a social scene. They did this one study where they showed vignettes to adolescent boys with ASD and asked them to describe whether it was bullying happening, was it not bullying, was it a happy, neutral event, and it was surprising that actually there was a lot of confusion sometimes, and not accurate understanding of what was going on in the social interaction. So improving social perception in individuals with ASD might have an impact on preventing some of these situations from happening. The other thing that seemed to come up in the literature was that the role of peers, parents and teachers, that bullying is not, again, it's been mentioned before, just about the individual or the individuals involved, but it's really involves a lot of other people who support the children, like teachers and parents and peers. And one of the things that has been shown, even in just the typically developing literature on bullying, is that peers can prolong or stop bullying. So for example, they did this one study where they looked at what happens in a bullying situation, and they found that there were different people playing different roles. There's always the bully and the victim, but there's also, for example, a reinforcer of the bully, an assistant to the bully, an outsider, and a defender of the victim. So there's different roles that people take or can take in bullying situations, and rather than just focus on the bully or the victim alone, we need to think more broadly about what else is happening in the environment there. And the other point that was made was to attend to both the positive and negative peer interactions. That if we're always just focusing on negative peer interactions, it's sort of like we're always in crisis mode or always in intervention mode as opposed to prevention. But rather what they were suggesting is that we need to think about what are some positive peer interactions that are happening in the school. How can we promote that? How can we sustain that? What are some of the things that help to facilitate those kinds of interactions? And just the culture of the school or the environment is really important to attend to. Related to that was this whole idea of awareness, knowledge of the disability, and modeling from adults. And I think that that's been brought up a lot. Both Lizzie and Elizabeth brought this up, that really if the teachers don't have, or the parents themselves are somehow not comfortable with the disability, or they're not knowledgeable about the disability, and there's poor awareness, the peers don't understand it, don't know about it, there's just overall a lack of information, and sometimes it's not intentional, but peers just don't know what to do or don't know how to approach other children who have disabilities. And so one of the things that was mentioned as a sort of preventative measure was to help teachers, peers, and even parents in some cases build their knowledge and give them tools to help them model really good sort of social interactions. I remember one parent said to me one time, when I find myself in a situation at the park, for example, with my child, I don't know how to handle the situation. How can I expect my child or the other child to know how to handle the situation? Because you really do find yourself, I find myself with my own young children sometimes, watching an interaction unfold and not knowing quite what to do. Would this be the right thing to do, or would this be the right thing to do? And then you're kind of frozen. And so I imagine that for people who have a child with ASD, or a teacher or parent, whatever, sometimes it's that lack of knowing what to do or being unprepared at the moment to have to react. And then I'm just going to summarize by saying that there are still so many questions that remain. There's really such a small amount of research out there to really guide us in terms of where to go next. I think there is a need for a lot more research to understand the sort of more specific issues related to ASD, but even more generally about this whole sort of notion of bullying. I think there's still a lot of controversy about what bullying actually is and what it isn't, and whether that bullying, the definition that we have now, is sufficient to really capture everything that needs to be captured, specifically when we're talking about issues related to ASD. Excuse me. One of the things that we can sort of look at other literatures, like for example the resilience literature, where children who've been maltreated or children who've had trauma, how do they cope and sometimes actually remain resilient despite those very difficult situations. And in some cases, the individuals themselves actually say that those experiences made them stronger, sometimes actually interpreting it in a very positive way. I don't think we know enough about the experiences, both positive and negative, of people with ASD or their family members to be able to even sort of comment on that, or to learn from maybe some positive experiences and help us to sort of figure out, okay, what can help? What are some things that have been useful in some situations? I think that there is something pretty unique about the experience of people with ASD. I mean, I think we have to consider as a group that these individuals have some particular, sort of ways of interpreting information that's really quite different from the rest of us. And in some ways, it works against them, and sometimes it works for them. So one example is I remember a young man that I was working with whose visual memory was just unbelievably vivid and incredibly detailed. So, a reliving, a memory of being bullied in high school was just as clear and vivid now that he was a young adult as it was when he was going through it as an adolescent. And it got to a point where I think he was very isolated and very low and depressed, where it started to fester. And he was just, as Dr. Bailey says, sort of stuck on it, but then went even further and, sort of went on Facebook and started searching back his high school classmates and then targeting them very specifically on Facebook. And so it can have, so what I'm saying is that there's a sort of interaction there where, some of the characteristics of ASD, the sort of obsessiveness and the very vivid visual, perceptual, and memory abilities that they have can actually sort of work against them in some situations like this. And I think that is something we have to be aware of as a risk factor that we need to consider. I guess, there's so many other questions that haven't been answered, but one of the things that, we don't often do in research on ASD is we don't ask people with ASD often enough. We don't get their perspective. We often struggle with how do we get their perspective? How do we get the information from them? But we certainly need a lot more understanding, not just from their teachers, their parents, but from them specifically. And so we still struggle with how do we do that, but that's something that probably needs to be done. Okay.